You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Hello there. Welcome back to the second episode on the General Assembly 2026 Overtures. If you have not listened to the first episode, you might want to go back and do that because I did a basic, what I called an audio tour of General Assembly, just a walkthrough of what happens during the week of General Assembly and all the committee meetings that happen before the live stream is even on, and then some of what you can expect on the docket for the main meetings of General Assembly. And I gave you a little bit of background there about some of those committees and what they do, and that information can be helpful in understanding some of the overtures that are up for votes this year, so you might want to go back and take a look at that. Just a couple of notes. In the last episode, when I recorded it, it was still up in the air whether the study committee on the directory for worship would be presenting their report. They are not going to be presenting their final report. Their report is out, and I've linked to it in the show notes, but they are still going to continue on for another year, and they'll give their final report at next year's General Assembly in 2027. Also, the Study Committee on Christian Nationalism is in the same boat. They are not going to present until next year at the 2027 General Assembly, but they have released a preliminary report. From what I understand, there's going to be more to it, but the preliminary report is available, and I'm going to link to that in the show notes so that you can take a look at that too if you'd like to. Before I dive into the overtures, just want to remind you that there are lots of great resources out there if you want to take a deeper dive into all of the technical and Book of Church Order aspects of these overtures and how they compare to each other. Some of the best resources are the Polity Matters podcast. They have a 3.5-hour episode on all of the overtures. The Alliance for Mission and Renewal roundtables, as of this recording, 2 of them are available. The third one will probably be available today or within the next few days, and I will link to those in the show notes. Also, a reminder that Ben Ratliff, one of the hosts of the Polity Matters podcast, has put together a really cool Overtures library. It's an app, but right now it's just available by a link, and I'm putting that in the show notes so you can take a look. It will give you a quick look at the voting recommendations from 4 different guys now. There's been a 4th person whose commentary has been added, and his vote recommendations are there in the app. So you can just look at an overture and see, 2 people want to vote no, 1 person wants to refer it back, and 1 person wants to vote yes, and get an idea for what the general opinions might be about the overtures as we approach General Assembly. In the first episode on General Assembly overtures, I was pretty much just sharing factually what each overture does, and I'm going to do that again with the overtures that we're going to discuss in this episode. But I do have some opinions on some of these, especially the ones that relate to the rules of discipline, because those are very closely connected to the work that I do on a regular basis in supporting people who are working their way through the church courts of the PCA in some form or another. So I'm going to share those thoughts at the end. The main focus of the podcast will be neutral information about what the overtures intend to do. If you want my opinions, stay till the end, and I'll share some of those with you. So just as a reminder, in the first episode, we covered presbytery boundaries, overtures that request some form of denominational prayer or thanksgiving, study committee-related overtures, and then a whole bunch of miscellaneous overtures. In this episode, we're going to cover overtures that are related to committees and agencies of the General Assembly, and then overtures that are related to the rules of discipline. So again, these are not official PCA categories. These are just my own categories for grouping overtures that cover similar ideas. We're going to start by talking about overtures related to committees and agencies. And again, I covered some background on these committees and agencies in the last episode, but just a few details that will help you follow these overtures. First of all, the Administrative Committee, probably the most powerful committee in the General Assembly. It is made up of 20 members, and 11 of those are what we call members at large, which means they are elected directly from the floor of General Assembly. The other 9, however, are chosen by the other program committees and agencies to serve as representatives to the Administrative Committee for 1 year. So understanding the makeup of the Administrative Committee is helpful in understanding some of these overtures. Another thing that we talked about in the last episode is floor nominees. So remember that the nominating committee is going to present the General Assembly with a slate of officers to fill vacancies in committees and agencies, and they present a slate of just one person to fill each of those vacancies. Floor nominees would be people that are nominated by commissioners to General Assembly to run against any one of the people in any of those slots. And remember that the nominating committee chooses the slate of candidates for those vacancies based on presbytery nominees. So presbyteries nominate men, nominating committee chooses from amongst those nominees to create a slate, and then floor nominees can be anyone who's eligible to fit those slots. Another thing to know is that each of the program committees of the General Assembly, so that would be Reformed University Fellowship, Mission to the World, Mission to North America, and Committee on Discipleship Ministries, those 4 committees each have a chief officer who's called a coordinator. So the coordinator of Mission to the World or the coordinator of Reformed University Fellowship. Those coordinators are elected annually, and so is the stated clerk. The stated clerk is the chief administrative officer of the Administrative Committee, but he's also the stated clerk of the whole PCA, and he's also elected annually. So these terms for both the coordinators and for the stated clerk, they begin and end at General Assembly. So when someone is elected, their position starts as soon as General Assembly is over, and it ends next year at the next General Assembly, and they have to be reelected annually. And another thing to keep in mind as we talk about these overtures that are related to committees and agencies is that part of our history as a denomination is that we came out of, not every congregation, but largely at the founding of the PCA, we came out of the PCUS, which was the Southern Presbyterian Church, the mainline Southern Presbyterian Church. And one of the concerns of the things that were developing in that mainline church is that the denominational committees and agencies were growing collectively more and more powerful, and it reduced the ability of conservatives on the ground to have any impact on the direction that the denomination was going. And so you'll probably hear the term grassroots. We talk a lot about grassroots in the PCA and how it's important for kind of your average everyday Joe, teaching elder, ruling elder, to be able to influence what's happening in General Assembly. And so there are overtures that are related to making sure that the commissioners at General Assembly who come from local churches have the opportunity to have oversight and input on the things that the General Assembly committees and agencies are doing. So that background might be helpful as you consider some of these proposals and overtures. So let's start with 2 overtures that have to do with the Administrative Committee. As I mentioned, 20 members, 11 are members at large. The other 9 are representatives of each of the other committees and agencies. So Overture 5 proposes to prohibit the election of more than one member at large from the same presbytery. So in other words, the 11 members at large would all need to be from different presbyteries. And that's to avoid concentration of power in any one presbytery. Overture 68 proposes that members of the Administrative Committee who are representatives from the other committees and agencies would participate as advisory or non-voting members. So in other words, they could attend the meetings, they could stay if the Administrative Committee went into executive session, they could participate in deliberation, but they could not vote. A similar overture was tried last year and failed, so I'm not sure if this is just let's try it again, or if they feel like a different approach to how the overture is worded or exactly what is proposed might be more successful, but we'll have to see how that unfolds at General Assembly. I also have put in the show notes a link to a page on the Presbyterian Pew website where we list all the current membership of all of the denominations, committees, and agencies, and the Standing Judicial Commission. This information is all public and it's all straight from the General Assembly's directory, but it's a little bit difficult to direct folks to, so I've just put that information all on a page. I'll link to it in the show notes. So if you're curious to know who's currently on the administrative committee, how many presbyteries are represented on any particular committee, does my presbytery have any representatives on any of those committees, you can take a look at that information. All right, let's talk a little bit about floor nominations. Now, currently, the way that this works is that commissioners have until right before dinner on Wednesdays to submit their floor nominations. And submitting a name for a floor nomination includes the person's name and their presbytery and all that, a little bio about them. And then the nominating committee needs to take all of those floor nominations and, first of all, just make sure that all of those people actually qualify for those slots. They have to make sure that this person isn't currently serving on another committee, or they didn't just finish a term serving on that committee or something like that. But once they've vetted those folks and made sure that they actually can serve in those positions, then they need to update the nominating committee report to include all of those names and all of those biographies. And since the report of the nominating committee to General Assembly is Thursday morning, there's often a very narrow window between when the nominating committee puts out their revised report with all of these new candidates and new names and when that vote takes place. So one of the concerns is that there's just not much time for commissioners to consider the new candidates and look at the bios and compare experience and abilities and things like that and decide who they want to vote on. So Overture 8 proposes to move the deadline for submitting floor nominations back 24 hours. So it would be like right before dinner on Tuesday instead of right before dinner on Wednesday. One of the arguments for doing this is that floor nominations can actually happen in advance of General Assembly. Since floor nominations can be submitted electronically and actually almost always are submitted electronically, there's no reason to wait until people are boots on the ground at General Assembly for these floor nominations. So if the deadline were moved back 24 hours, that would give the nominating committee the opportunity to submit their revised report earlier. It would give commissioners more time just to consider the votes and the decisions that they're going to make on Thursday morning during the report of the nominating committee. Overture 9 proposes an amendment that would require floor nominations to include a rationale as to how this nominee would contribute to proportional representation from different presbyteries. So there is a line in the Book of Church Order that talks about how committees and agencies should strive for proportional representation. There are not any rules about how that has to happen, but this overture would just suggest that if you're going to submit a floor nominee, you have to put something in there, maybe in the bio part or something like that, that would say, we think this person would be a good person to vote for because he's from XYZ Presbytery and they don't currently have any representation. Or we think this person would be good to vote for because the candidate that the nominating committee recommended is from the same presbytery as this other guy who's already on the committee. So this overture would just encourage there to be a conscious thought given towards proportional representation when someone is submitting a floor nomination. Overtures 45 and 47 are very similar. They request that it would be required for floor nominations to be limited only to men who were previously nominated by their own presbyteries, but not selected for the nominating committee's slate of candidates. So in other words, if a presbytery recommended somebody for filling a slot on the Committee for Discipleship Ministries, but the nominating committee chose another nominee to fill that slot, then that nominee who wasn't chosen could be a floor nominee to run against the person that the nominating committee chose. All right, there are a couple of overtures that have to do with other ways in which the General Assembly could oversee the activity of committees. Overture 11 relates to Mission to North America. So Mission to North America oversees a variety of different ministries and activities, but one of the things that they oversee is church planting. And they offer a church planter's assessment. So, in other words, a man who's considering becoming a church planter could go through this assessment program, and presumably it would help him to assess whether he has gifts and skills that make him a good fit for this type of role. Overture 11 just requests that this data about the assessments, how many are given, what's the outcome, what happens to men who go through this assessment and then plant churches with the PCA. Does this program seem to be successful? Is it helping? Is it an accurate assessment? So Overture 11 is requesting more data about that so that the General Assembly can do a better job of supervising the work that MNA does. Overture 32 proposes to require each permanent committee and agency to submit their standing rules or their operations manuals for review by their respective committee of commissioners each year. So remember that a committee of commissioners is a group of commissioners to the General Assembly who volunteered to be on a committee that gives oversight to each of the permanent committees and agencies. So, for example, somebody could be serving on the Committee of Commissioners for RUF, for Reformed University Fellowship. That means that they would be reviewing the minutes of the permanent committee's meetings, they'd be reviewing the budget, those types of things. So Overture 32 just requests that another thing that the Committee of Commissioners would have the opportunity to see and review would be any operations manuals or standing rules that those permanent committees use to carry out their business. All right, as I mentioned before, the stated clerk is the stated clerk for the whole denomination, but he's also the chief officer for the administrative committee. The other 4 permanent committees, which are called program committees, have coordinators as their chief officers. And so there are some overtures that relate to the election of the stated clerk and the election of the coordinators. Overture 40 seeks to change the start and end date for the terms for the stated clerk and the coordinators of the program committee. So as I said before, right now these run from General Assembly to General Assembly. So that could lead to a sticky situation where a man shows up at General Assembly and then Thursday morning he finds out that his job is going to end at the end of the week. And so this overture suggests that perhaps we should change the terms of service from, instead of running from General Assembly to General Assembly, they would run from January 1st to December 31st. So that would give a person a little bit of advance notice. Your job is going to end at the end of the year. You should prepare to have something else in line to start in the new year. Overture 41 proposes that we elevate the threshold for electing coordinators and stated clerks. So instead of just a simple 50% majority, elevate it to require a 2/3 supermajority to ensure that these leadership positions really have a demonstrated mandate from the Assembly. Overtures 43 and 77 both propose to change the term of service for the coordinators and the stated clerk to 4-year terms instead of 1-year terms, just to allow more stability in that role. Overture 73 proposes that if the stated clerk or a program committee coordinator has been elected for 3 or more successive 1-year terms, so in other words, been elected again for 3 years in a row, the election for an additional year requires a 2/3 supermajority. So in other words, to serve a 4th year or anything beyond that would require a 2/3 vote instead of just a 50% vote. Overture 78 and 79, and those both propose amendments to the rules of assembly operation so that General Assembly committees can meet electronically if they needed, instead of just only in person. And that would mean like a Zoom meeting instead of everybody flying to Atlanta to meet. So those are the overtures that are before the General Assembly that have to do with the committees and agencies of the General Assembly. Let's move on now to some overtures that have to do with the rules of discipline. And again, as I mentioned before, there are 3 main sections to the Book of Church Order. The first is the form of government, which outlines how our church government is set up, how ordination works, all those things. The second section is the rules of discipline, and this has to do with all things church discipline, investigations, trials, censures, all that. And then the third section is the directory for worship, and that's the section that the study committee on the directory for worship is working on revising. But the overtures we're about to talk about all relate to that middle section, the rules of discipline. There are a number of overtures that relate to filing appeals and complaints. So just a quick note on the difference between those, because it can be confusing. Appeals are only relevant in a judicial process. For the most part, that's going to happen when there's been a trial. There are a couple of other times when it can happen, but for the most part, appeals happen after a trial. The person who's, quote unquote, the losing party can file an appeal. And they do have a deadline of how long they have to file that appeal after the verdict has been rendered. In a complaint, any person who's subject to the jurisdiction of a court, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but anybody who's subject to the original jurisdiction of a court can file a complaint about a decision of that court. So that means that church members, ruling officers, deacons can file complaints about decisions of their session, and then teaching elders or ruling elders who are a commissioner to a particular presbytery meeting can file complaints about decisions made at that presbytery meeting. Both appeals and complaints can be carried up to the next highest court. So if someone is found guilty by their session, they could appeal that to the presbytery. If the presbytery doesn't overturn their conviction, they could appeal it to the General Assembly. The same thing with the complaint. A member could file a complaint against their session. If the session denies the complaint, they could elevate it to their presbytery. If the presbytery denies the complaint, they could elevate it to the General Assembly. So Overture 15 seeks to clarify the deadlines for filing appeals and complaints, because as I said, there's some time limits attached there. After a verdict of the court, you have 30 days to appeal. After a decision of a court of the church, you have 60 days to file a complaint. There are some questions. Sometimes people are a little confused about when does that 30-day or 60-day clock start ticking. So Overture 15 is seeking to clarify some of the language about when a decision is considered to have been made, and therefore, when does that clock on 30 days or 60 days start ticking? Overtures 29 and 75 are both going at the same thing. They're seeking to clarify something that can be a little bit confusing. As I mentioned, when a verdict is rendered against someone, they have 30 days to file an appeal. Now, the Book of Church Order is clear that when someone appeals, that temporarily suspends their censure. So what that means is, if the verdict in the case is that a person is guilty, and the censure that was attached to that verdict is, for example, that they are suspended from the Lord's Supper, if they appeal, then their suspension from the Lord's Supper is temporarily suspended. So that means that they temporarily have access to the Lord's Supper again while their appeal is in process. However, it's a little unclear, or at least for some folks, it seems like it's been a little confusing about when the suspension of the censure happens, and whether that happens when the person just gives notice that they plan to appeal, they've notified the court of their intent to appeal, or does that happen when they actually file the appeal? Just saying, hey, heads up, I'm planning to appeal. Does that suspend their censure? Or is it not until they provide a written appeal, which has to include their reasons for appealing and the grounds on which they are appealing, and they have to deliver that to the clerk of the court that found them guilty and the next highest court? Is that what suspends their censure temporarily? So Overture 29 seeks an interesting way about that. They say that a verbal notice can be given immediately as soon as the judgment is announced, and that would suspend the censure for 30 days. So it's like a holding period. You've given verbal notice that you are planning to appeal, so therefore we're going to suspend your censure temporarily during that 30-day period. But if you don't actually file your appeal, then the suspension of your censure evaporates once that 30-day window is over. However, if you do file that written appeal within the 30-day window, then the suspension of your censure would continue until the appeal process is over. Overture 75 suggests a slightly different approach, which would just be that they remove the phrase notice of appeal from 3 different paragraphs in the Book of Church Order. So in other words, the notice of appeal is no longer a thing. A person has 30 days to appeal. And when they appeal, which is a written document filed with the clerks of 2 courts, then their censure would be temporarily suspended. Now, another aspect to suspension of censure during appeal is that, if needed, a presbytery or a session can vote to administratively hold that censure in place during the appeal. So, for example, if a pastor has been suspended from office and then he appeals his verdict, it may be important for the purity of the church and for the safety of the people he's in charge of that he not carry out the duties of his office while his appeal is in place. So a court of the church, a session or a presbytery, can vote to keep that suspension in place while the appeal process is going on, but it takes a 2/3 majority. And Overture 75 adds a little bit of extra language to specify when that would be appropriate. It says, quote, only when in the judgment of a 2/3 majority of the court of original jurisdiction, there is a risk of the appellant doing harm to the name of Christ and his church before the case is finally decided. So it shouldn't be a routine thing where you just say, we don't care that you appealed, we're just going to keep your censure in place anyway. That should be done when there's a significant reason to prevent harm to the name of Christ or his church. And of course, that could include harm to the individual. Okay, now let's talk about circularizing the court. So in a PCA judicial proceeding, which could be a trial or an appeal or a complaint or anything like that, there are processes in place for how the court who is hearing the matter and deciding it handles that business. There's a trial, or there's a specific setup for how the hearing happens and who speaks first and how long do they speak and how long do they have to respond. And so it is really important that the deliberation over that matter happens within that context. What you don't want happening is one party who gets the ear of the judges or one of the judges and gets extra time to put in his reasoning and to try to convince that person. It's also difficult because it means that if that reasoning is happening outside of the hearing, outside the trial, privately, the other party doesn't know what's being said. They don't have a chance to respond to it. They don't have a chance to cross-examine if it's a witness. So there are rules against what's called circularizing the court, which means you can't seek to persuade the judges outside of the context of that formal trial or that hearing. There's currently a sentence about not circularizing the court in the chapter of the Book of Church Order about complaints. And Overture 16 argues that the placement of this sentence doesn't make sense and probably should be relocated. And here's their thinking on that. If you are going to submit a complaint, you actually submit that complaint first to the court against which you're complaining. And that might sound weird, but if you think about it, it makes sense. So if your session decides something and you think that is not a good idea, you're actually going to file a complaint first with your own session. And that just gives that session, or whatever court it is, the opportunity to hear that concern and respond to it before the next court gets involved. So the sentence about not circularizing the court comes after the information about submitting a complaint to that original court. But it's difficult to understand what that would look like or how one would prevent circularizing the court when that court is the one making the decision and they're also the ones who were involved in the decision in the first place. The initial submission of a complaint does not really involve that formal process of the hearing because the court itself is the body being complained against. It's not until it is elevated to the next level. So, for example, if a session denies a complaint and then the member elevates that complaint to the presbytery, then there would be a more formal hearing where the presbytery is acting as the third party, the individual who elevated the complaint is the complainant, the session or one of their representatives is the respondent. So you really do have those two parties, and that would be the context in which it would be important not to circularize the court, not for either of those groups to kind of try to privately get the ear of the judges and convince them of their perspective. So Overture 16 would just take that sentence about not circularizing the court and move it from the paragraph that addresses the initial submission of a complaint to the end of a later paragraph that talks about elevating the complaint to the next court. All right, I mentioned a minute ago the term original jurisdiction, and I said I would explain that a little bit. So there are 3 levels of church courts: sessions, presbyteries, and the Standing Judicial Commission, or the judicial wing of our General Assembly. So every person in the PCA is subject to the original jurisdiction of only one court. Most people in the PCA are subject to the original jurisdiction of their session. So that includes all members of the church. It also includes deacons and ruling elders who are members of the church. But you may or may not know, teaching elders are actually not members of local churches. Teaching elders are members of presbytery. So the original jurisdiction for a teaching elder is his presbytery. Original jurisdiction basically means who gets the first shot at discipline if there's a charge that needs to be filed. So if a church member is sinning, a session would handle it. If a teaching elder is sinning, a presbytery would handle it. However, we use the term original jurisdiction because other courts can have appellate jurisdiction, right? So if you appeal something from your session to the presbytery, has jurisdiction there over the parties, but not original jurisdiction. There are situations where a court of the church can ask for help from the next highest court. That's called a referral. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there are also situations in which other courts of the church can step in and petition the next highest court to take over original jurisdiction of a case. So, for example, if there's a session that seems to be not dealing with an issue in their church, two other sessions in the same presbytery can petition the presbytery to take over that case. Or if there's a situation where it seems like a teaching elder is not being dealt with and the presbytery is not doing what it needs to be doing, two other presbyteries can petition the General Assembly, the Standing Judicial Commission, to take over that case. The wording currently says that if the session or presbytery, quote, refuses to act. So there are a couple of things that could potentially be concerning. First of all, two presbyteries is a fairly low bar compared to the number of presbyteries that we have now. And also the phrase refuses to act is a little bit vague. So for example, a presbytery could say, oh yeah, we looked into it, we talked to him, we don't think it's a problem. That's technically considered acting. They have acted on the matter. They haven't dealt with it in the way that maybe everybody else is feeling like they need to deal with it, but they have technically acted. So Overture 27 proposes to make a couple of tweaks here. So first of all, it would raise the bar of what it would take to require the Standing Judicial Commission to take over original jurisdiction from a presbytery. And it proposes two mechanisms for that happening. First of all, one option would be for presbyteries to petition the Standing Judicial Commission, but they've raised the number from 2 to 3. So if 3 presbyteries petition the Standing Judicial Commission to take over a case from a presbytery, they could. Or if it was a presbytery that originally submitted the report about this issue. So if Presbytery A sends a letter to Presbytery B and says, hey, this guy in your presbytery is doing bad stuff, you need to deal with it, and Presbytery B doesn't deal with it, then Presbytery A, all by themselves, could request that the General Assembly take over original jurisdiction. And they've also tweaked the language from refuses to act to fails to indict. In other words, the bar would be if the other presbytery does not bring charges, not just doesn't investigate or doesn't talk about it or doesn't do anything, but doesn't bring charges, then the presbytery who submitted the report, or any 3 presbyteries in the PCA, could petition the General Assembly to take over original jurisdiction. So one note about this overture is, like I said before, there are mechanisms in place currently for sessions to petition their presbytery or for presbyteries to petition the General Assembly to take over original jurisdiction. This overture only relates to this matter at the presbytery level. Other presbyteries asking the General Assembly to take over the case. It does not relate to other sessions asking a presbytery to take over a case. Part of the thinking there could be that errant teaching elders can have a lot more damaging effect on the denomination than, say, an errant member or even a deacon or ruling elder. Or perhaps if this overture is successful and this mechanism seems to be helpful, then an overture proposing something similar on the session to presbytery level could be proposed in the future. All right, as I said a moment ago, that overture was talking all about ways in which other sessions or presbyteries can petition a higher court to take over original jurisdiction. But there are also situations in which a lower court voluntarily refers a case to a higher court. So for example, let's say there's a discipline case that needs to happen, but the session is tiny. They only have 2 members. And so there are not enough members in that session for one man to be a prosecutor and perhaps one man to represent the accused and for other people to sit as judges And so they might refer that matter to the presbytery, basically saying, can you handle this for us as if you were the session of the church? So Overture 29 is looking at something interesting in that case. And it addresses circumstances in which the presbytery does take over a matter, and that could potentially remove the ability of a church member to complain about the proceedings or about the decision on that case. So remember, I said a moment ago that members of local churches can file complaints about any decision of their session. So if the session is holding a trial, a church member has a right to complain about how that trial was carried out or the decision of that trial. But if the presbytery takes over that matter, church members could lose the right to complain. So Overture 28 would clarify that if a matter is being handled by the presbytery because it's taken a reference from the session, that members of that local church should still have the right to complain in matters that relate to that case. One thing that's been really interesting in listening to debate about this is that some have said, we don't really think we need Overture 28 because that's already a right that church members have had. And others have said, oh, we definitely should not vote for Overture 28 because we don't want to give regular church members a standing in the presbytery. That wouldn't be appropriate. So just because folks who are speaking about this issue have very differing ideas about whether this is already something that church members have a right to do, suggests that it might be a potential issue that's worth considering, because at the very least, there's some publicly divided opinions about what is already in place. And so if it isn't in place, perhaps it needs to be added. Or if it is in place, perhaps it needs to be added to clarify, because not everybody agrees that's already a right that church members have. All right, the next overture we're going to talk about has to do with indictments. Now, oftentimes, a judicial process begins with an investigation. So something has come to the attention of a session or presbytery that there's something that might need to be dealt with there. They have an investigation. The Book of Church Orders says that if that investigation finds a, quote, strong presumption of guilt, then they need to move forward to a trial. Strong presumption of guilt is not the same thing as guilty, but it essentially means that unless counter evidence is provided or unless cross-examination reveals that some of this is not true or something like that, this evidence appears to make this person look guilty. So we need to go ahead and have the trial to have an opportunity to examine that evidence and for other witnesses to testify and cross-examination and all that. So this overture 35, is specifically concerned with times where an investigation finds a strong presumption of guilt. But then for whatever reason, there's a very long delay before those charges are actually brought, before the indictment is written up and filed. And of course, you can imagine how this would be difficult for a teaching elder. This is his job that's on the line. An investigation has found a strong presumption of guilt, but there's a long waiting period before the trial even starts. So this overture would propose to specify a 60-day deadline in order to ensure that this process is handled more efficiently. Once a judicial commission investigation finds a strong presumption of guilt, they need to choose a prosecutor, and the prosecutor needs to submit an indictment, which includes the charges and then the specifications, the specific examples of that sin within a 60-day deadline. Okay, Overture 46 deals with situations in which people are not making use of the church courts and instead are going to social media or journalists or something like that to address problems that they see in the church. So this overture would add an additional provision such that if somebody is talking about accusations publicly on social media or being interviewed for articles without having gone through the church court process, it could be considered a violation of the 9th commandment. This is the exact language that would be added to chapter 29 of the Book of Church Order. Any public statement made outside of a court of the church alleging an offense or unconstitutional action of a church, presbytery, agency, committee, or individual member of the PCA that is not first reported to the court of original jurisdiction, ordinarily after the reporter has made a reasonable effort to contact the alleged errant entity or individual to potentially clear up the matter, shall be considered a probable violation of the 9th commandment and an offense under this chapter to be addressed by normal judicial process, BCO 31, etc. The rationale for this overture is almost completely comprised of the Westminster Larger Catechism on the Ninth Commandment. Now let's talk about contumacy. So contumacy occurs when somebody is judged to be uncooperative with the courts of the church. This could happen through a trial. They could go through a trial and be found guilty of contumacy and be censured. Or what we more often think of happening is someone is found to be contumacious, to be guilty of contumacy, because they just don't show up. They just don't participate. So charges are filed against someone. They're cited to appear. They don't show up. They're cited to appear again. They don't show up. The Book of Church Order specifies that after failing to appear for 2 citations, a person can be found guilty of contumacy and excommunicated. And so Overture 54 wants to address situations in which that happens. The overture doesn't specify whether it's talking about contumacy as a verdict from a trial or contumacy because somebody just doesn't show up, but I'm guessing they're thinking of the second kind of contumacy. So this overture suggests that if someone is excommunicated for contumacy, that they ought to have a right to complain, but not to appeal against that judgment, as no judgment has previously been rendered in their case. So it is true that if someone is excommunicated for not participating in the trial, they don't get to appeal because they didn't participate in the trial. If they had participated in the trial, then they could appeal the judgment, but they didn't participate in the trial, so they can't appeal. The question is whether they should be allowed to complain or not if they've been excommunicated for not participating in the trial. Overture 56 is proposing to make some changes to a section of the Book of Church Order that was just recently changed. Back in 2024, there was an overture that proposed to broaden the pool of people who could potentially represent someone who is accused of sin in a PCA church court trial. So Book of Church Order, Chapter 32, Paragraph 19, talks about who can represent someone. That overture was passed with some amended language in 2024. It was approved by more than 2/3 of the presbyteries, and then it got final approval at the Second General Assembly in 2025. And so just this most recent version of the Book of Church Order that was published has this newly amended language. As it stands right now, if you are accused, you may be represented by anyone else in your presbytery, whether that's a teaching elder or a ruling elder or deacon or a member. Anyone who's a member in good standing in your presbytery may represent you in a trial before your session or before your presbytery. And if you are appealing to the Standing Judicial Commission, you can be represented by anyone in good standing in the PCA. Overture 56 has to do with leaving membership in a PCA church. Now, there are multiple ways that somebody could become no longer a member of a PCA church. And some of those ways are disciplinary measures, right? So we talked a moment ago about contumacy. If you're cited to appear for a trial and you just will not appear and you won't cooperate, you could be excommunicated for contumacy. You could be excommunicated after a trial. You also could be erased from the rolls, which is not exactly the same as excommunication, but effectively it's similar. You could be erased from the rolls. First of all, if you just stop showing up at the church, you won't respond to emails or phone calls, you won't get in touch with anybody, they don't know where you've gone. Or if you actively say, I am not coming back, I am not going to keep my vows, I am not going to submit to the government and discipline at the church. For those reasons, you could be erased from the rolls. You could also be erased from the rolls if you say to your church, hey, I'm going to transfer over and become a Mormon, or I'm going to transfer over and become a Wiccan, or some other religious organization that the PCA would not consider to be a faithful, gospel-preaching, sacrament-administering body. If you say that you're going to become a member of one of those groups, the session would be obligated to warn you, and then if you won't listen and you continue on, then they would need to erase you from the rolls. All of those are disciplinary ways to be removed from church membership. But there are 2 current non-disciplinary ways to leave membership in the PCA. And of course, the most common is that you just transfer your membership to another church. So you're going to a PCA church, you move to another state, you transfer your membership to a PCA church in that state. Or you go to an OPC church or other similar church, and your session sends a letter to that session transferring your membership. That's one non-disciplinary way to leave. Another non-disciplinary way to leave is if you are going from a PCA church to a church that either doesn't do membership or they just don't accept transfers of membership. So maybe you leave a PCA church and you go to a non-denominational church and they just don't have membership. So you're not being disciplined, but the PCA church is going to remove your name from the rolls just as an administrative acknowledgement that you're no longer under their care. You're no longer their shepherding responsibility. You are worshiping elsewhere. So those are the non-disciplinary ways to leave PCA church membership. Overture 59 would like to add a third non-disciplinary way to leave a PCA church, and that is just to say, I am not going to be a member of this church anymore, but I am going to be a member of another church, but I just don't know where that is yet. So you don't have information to give them about where you're going to be going next, but you are not going to be a member of this church anymore. So you're not saying, I'm not a Christian. You're saying for whatever reason, the overture suggests maybe your convictions have changed and you're no longer in alignment with Reformed theology or with Presbyterian church government or something where you feel you can no longer be a member of this PCA church, but you don't have information to give on where you're going to land. So this overture would suggest that somebody can just have their name removed from the rolls in a non-disciplinary way, even if they don't have information about where they're transferring yet. Now, I do want to clarify that if you leave a PCA church, let's say you move to another state, you have up to a year to get back to your PCA session about where you're transferring. So if you're moving to a new state and you need to visit around and try some different churches, decide where you're going to land, you don't have to immediately have that information. You do have a year, and the intention of that year is so that while you're still looking for churches, in some way, your original PCA session can still provide care for you, can still check in on you, can still pray for you until you've officially transferred your membership to another church. But the proposal in Overture 59 would perhaps most apply to a situation where it seems a person knows that they're not going to land in another similar type of church. They may land in a different type of church. They just aren't sure what that would be yet. And maybe they need more than a year to make that decision. It will be very interesting to see what commissioners do with this overture and whether they feel like this is a bad idea or a good idea. Okay, Overture 59 relates to Chapter 38, Paragraph 1 of the Book of Church Order. And 38.1 is a paragraph that is referenced so often that it actually has become a noun. So you might hear somebody say, that was a 38.1, or an adjective, that was a 38.1 case. It's also referred to as a case without process. So what this means is that instead of holding a trial, a person has confessed their own guilt. The purpose of a trial is to determine whether someone is guilty or not guilty. But if the individual comes forward and confesses, then a trial is not necessary to determine their guilt. The court, in this case, would need to decide on a censure, but they don't need to decide on a guilty or not guilty verdict. It seems pretty clear that the spirit of 38.1 is when a person comes forward of their own volition to confess a sin. But it is possible that this paragraph could be used by a person who maybe they catch wind that the session's about to find out about something, or maybe somebody says, if you don't go confess, I'm going to tell the session. And so they come and they tell their version of things, but they're not necessarily doing it just because their conscience has convicted them and the Holy Spirit is prompting them to get help from their elders. So Overture 65 would clarify some things. First of all, it would limit this to only being able to be used when the court hears about this sin first from the person who's confessing it. So if the court's already heard about it from someone else, and then the person comes forward to confess, it adds a provision about how that could be handled. The court would investigate the matter. The court would write out their description of what they see the sins to be. And if the person is willing to sign on the dotted line and say, yep, I agree, that's what I did, that's what I'm guilty of, that's fine. But what this overture would be trying to avoid is situations in which a person comes forward to quote unquote confess so that they can minimize or control the narrative about what happened and avoid a full investigation of the matter. So Overture 65 would also clarify that if they haven't come forward fully voluntarily, or if the court actually heard about the sin from somewhere else, then they need to proceed to investigate it fully and make sure that they know from other parties what all might be involved before they can accept a confession. This is the paragraph that would be added in those cases. In such cases where anyone other than the offender reveals his offense to the court shall investigate into the veracity of the accusations and draw up a document detailing the alleged offenses to serve as a written confession which the accused may sign if he willfully confesses his guilt in regard to the alleged offenses. If the accused refuses to sign the document, the court may proceed with process. With process just means hold a trial. Okay, another chapter of the Book of Church Order that has become its own noun or adjective is 40-5. So you may hear somebody say they decided to submit a 40-5. Chapter 40 in the Book of Church Order relates to the regular review and control of lower courts by higher courts. So we talked in the last episode about the review of Presbytery Records Committee and how every year, every session must submit their minutes to Presbytery for review. And every year, all the presbyteries have to submit their minutes to the General Assembly for review. And the review of Presbytery Records Committee is the committee of the General Assembly that does that reviewing. And so in this chapter of the Book of Church Order about that regular review and control, paragraph 5 has this specific language in it. It says that when a higher court receives, quote, a credible report with respect to the court next below of any important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional proceeding, what they have to do is to cite that lower court to appear and give an account to a higher court. It's like a trial, but it's a whole court, or at least a representative of that court that's appearing, as opposed to an individual who is on trial. So Overture 67 wants to make it really clear that it's not just any old report that you receive that would require you to cite the court to appear, but first of all, you'd have to verify that if this thing is really true, then it would really qualify as an important delinquency or a grossly unconstitutional proceeding. And 2, that there's enough documentation to provide evidence that this thing happened and to prove that it is credible in order for the lower court to be cited to appear before the higher court. The next overture has to do with the record of the case. So Overture 69 seeks to clarify what material the clerk of a court would need to compile as part of a record of the case. So when a verdict is issued by a lower court, as I said before, the person against whom the verdict has been rendered has a right to appeal. And when that person appeals, when they actually file their appeal, then the clerk of that court has 30 days to send the record of the case to the clerk of the next highest court. And that's so that if a person's found guilty by their session, they appeal to the presbytery, the clerk of the session sends the record of the case to the presbytery so that when the presbytery considers the matter, they have all the relevant documents. Sometimes clerks are not sure what needs to be included, or maybe they don't include everything because they didn't realize those things needed to be included. So this would just specify exactly what needs to be included, exactly what counts as the record of the case and has to be included when the clerk of the lower court sends it to the higher court. Overture 85 has to do with objections. So currently, Chapter 45 in the Book of Church Order covers dissents, protests, and objections. And these are 3 different ways that ruling elders or teaching elders who are members of a court can express their disapproval of a vote, and it depends on whether they were or were not allowed to participate in a vote. So, for example, if there was a vote that happened and they weren't allowed to participate in it because it was related to their session or their presbytery, or if there's a vote that happened and they were allowed to participate in the vote but they don't agree with the outcome, those options are dissents, protests, and objections. And Overture 85 proposes to pull out objections from that chapter, put it in its own chapter. Now, conveniently, Chapter 44 of the Book of Church Order is currently empty. If you look up Chapter 44 in the Book of Church Order, it just says in parentheses, vacated, because the language that used to be there is somewhere else. There's nothing in Chapter 44. So Overture 85 says, hey, let's use Chapter 44 just for objections. So a lot of what has happened is just language that was already in Chapter 45 about objections has been moved to Chapter 44. There's also been some copying and pasting of language related to how that would be filed and with whom it would be filed that's also been pasted into 44 to apply to objections. But then there's some additional information in there. So not a big change in procedure, but just making it its own chapter, essentially. And then finally, we've gotten to the last overture that has to do with the rules of discipline, and that is Overture 86. And it has to do with changing the name of a complaint to an inquiry. The rationale for this overture actually cites a case where a person who filed a complaint was treated as though he was insubordinate to his church leadership for filing that complaint. So this overture suggests that perhaps renaming complaints to inquiries could make them sound less like they are malicious or antagonistic, and perhaps help matters to be settled without adding any unnecessary tension. All right, we've reached the end of the factual presentation of the overtures and what they're intended to do and how they work, and some background to help you understand them. And now, if you will permit me, I have some opinions that I would like to share. So first of all, Overture 28, I mentioned this as we were talking about it. Are church members allowed to complain about a matter if that's a matter that their session would have handled, but it's been referred to the presbytery? And again, one of the main reasons why I think this would be a good overture to pass is because it seems like there's already confusion about whether this is something church members have a right to do or not. If church members do indeed have a right to do this thing, but people who know the BCO very well see it differently, then adding this amendment to clarify that they have that right seems like a good thing. I do think it's very important for church members to be able to have a say in matters that are directly related to their own church and to their own session. Overture 46. This has to do with when there are public statements made when someone has not made use of the church courts. I do understand the reasoning behind this one. It is very disturbing to see, especially officers of the church, slinging accusations on X especially, which used to be called Twitter. It's unprofessional. It is very unattractive. And I do think that some of those statements could be argued to be a violation of the 9th commandment. My personal feeling is that if these statements are a violation of the 9th commandment, then they should be handled by charges of violations of the 9th commandment. Generally, I'm in favor of charges being brought against people directly from Scripture or Scripture as interpreted by our standards, but not adding extra things to the Book of Church Order in application of Scripture and as it's interpreted by our standards. Overture 59, which is adding an extra non-disciplinary way for members to leave churches. I have some sympathy with that. In my situation, what I often encounter is people who want to leave church membership because they've become increasingly concerned or even alarmed with how leadership is handling abuse disclosures, or perhaps they see a pattern of what appears to be domineering or controlling leadership. And when a person has been in that position, as you can imagine, they may be unpacking a whole lot and trying to figure out how a church that appeared to be a good, healthy church on the outside turned out not to be what they thought it was. And it causes them to have doubts and concerns about how they will go about looking for a new church. And so if they have to immediately transfer their membership to another church or to immediately tell their church where they are transferring, it may put them in a bit of a bind. And so perhaps having an option to have your name removed from the rolls in a non-disciplinary way and giving yourself some time, maybe more than a year, to figure out where you're going to land next, and not just where you're going to attend, but where you're going to make a decision to become a member and be under the authority of a new system of church government. I can see some benefit there to having some time for that. I'm not sure if that's the scenario that the author of this overture had in mind, and I'm very curious to see how commissioners discuss it at General Assembly. Overtures 29 and/or 75 both seem relevant and helpful. They have to do with when someone's censure is suspended. In other words, when does that appeal process officially begin and suspend their censure? There have been cases where that has been an issue and that question has come up and been debated. So I feel like one way or another, it would be good to have that settled through an overture like one of these two or some amended version of it. And then finally, I have one overture that I would like to talk about in a bit more depth. I'm going to give you a brief overview of my thoughts here, but I did write an article about this where I've been able to flesh out everything in more detail. I'll link to that article in the show notes, but let me just give you the highlights here in the podcast. So Overture 56, as I mentioned, proposes to limit who would be qualified to represent an accused person in a trial before a presbytery or before the General Assembly to only officers. I want to clarify before I dive in that this is not something that would directly impact the work of Presbyterian Pew. What we do is to provide information and education to help people process what's happening in their specific cases, what their options are. Sometimes we help them draft documents, but we're not acting as representatives in a church court. So as you listen to this, if you're wondering, does she have these concerns because this would impact the work that she does? Not directly, but we do watch people struggle through the church court process and not have representation and not know who to go to for representation. So it's definitely relevant in that way. And there are 3 good reasons why I think this overture ought not to be approved. One is that it's been less than a year since we made the update to the Book of Church Order to expand this representation, and I would just like us to give it time to be tested. If we're seeking integrity of process, would it not be better for an accused person to be represented by a non-officer who understands the Book of Church Order even on a rudimentary level, rather than for the accused person to represent themselves if they themselves don't understand the Book of Church Order at all? I'm not convinced that everybody who needs representation has that representation or even knows where to go to look for it. I'm not aware of any circumstances where we've run into a kerfuffle because we've allowed a non-officer to represent someone in a presbytery or before the Standing Judicial Commission. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but if we haven't run into issues, I would want us to be slow to retract a benefit that we just now have extended. The second reason is that the rationale makes the argument that representing someone before a court makes that person a functional officer of the court. In one place it reads, quote, "Representatives of an accused, like prosecutors, effectually function as officers of the court that conducts the proceedings." I'm not sure that that's true, because if it is, I don't know what we do with the multiple situations that already exist in the BCO where a non-officer is permitted to represent someone in a court of the church. So the BCO allows any member in the PCA to become a voluntary prosecutor and to represent the entire denomination, in fact, in bringing charges before a session or a presbytery or even on an appeal before the Standing Judicial Commission. The BCO also allows any member in good standing in the PCA to represent an elevated complaint before a hearing of the presbytery or of the General Assembly on behalf of the complainant. And this very amendment that we're considering would allow a non-officer to represent a fellow church member in a trial before a court of their session. So I would not want us to communicate that we're okay allowing someone to become a functional officer as long as it only happens at the session level. My sense is what we need to do is to distinguish between who may sit as a judge in a case, which absolutely ought to be restricted to only the officers of the court, and on the other hand, the parties that bring the case to the court, which may or may not be officers, but have a right to make use of the mechanisms of accountability and oversight that are afforded to them in a Presbyterian polity, whether they are officers or not. And the final reason that I'd like to see this overture rejected by the General Assembly is more of a subjective one. A lot of times when someone comes to us for help, she is already under the impression, or she has the fear, that the deck is heavily stacked against her because she is not an officer. It seems to her like the officers are the inner circle. They all know each other. They're all friends with each other, and she's an outsider. And so her perception is that from the outset, she is severely disadvantaged in the process. I would not want us to pass an overture that would unnecessarily reinforce those ideas, that would inadvertently communicate the court is not for you unless you're an officer. In fact, the courts of the church are for her members. If we want our discipline to be effective, we need to remove any unnecessary obstacles to the ministerial and declarative work of our courts. We need to do whatever we can do within biblical parameters to protect the integrity of the process in the eyes of all the parties. Now, having said all this, I do agree with one major premise in the rationale to Overture 56, and that is that officers, especially ruling elders and teaching elders, really are the most likely people in any circle to understand the Book of Church Order, and to have experience with the PCA judicial process. Whether Overture 56 passes or not, the final sentence of BCO 3219 will still say, quote, "Courts are encouraged to suggest to the accused/appellant the names of potential representatives and potential advisors he might contact." So I'm just throwing this out there, but Presbyterian Pew would be honored to be suggested as a resource for a potential advisor. And we would also be very glad to connect with members, especially ruling and teaching elders from any presbytery, who would be willing to serve as a representative of an accused person in the courts of the church. Please feel free to reach out through the contact form on our website. You can find it at presbyterianpew.org/contact. If this is a way that you would be willing to serve, get in touch. We'll talk about it. As I said, I've fleshed out these ideas in more detail and probably more coherently in the article. So take a look at that link in the show notes if you want to read more about that. And thank you for joining me for part 2 of looking at the overtures to the 2026 General Assembly. In the third episode, we are going to talk about all of the overtures that have to do with officers and ordination and transfers and deacons and women. And as with this episode, the majority of the third episode will be factual information about the overtures, what they propose, what the reasoning is behind them. But I do have some opinions, and I will be sharing those at the end of the third episode. So please pray for me as I consider what to say and how to say it. And I'll be back next week with the final third of the 2026 overtures. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.